being
No,
here.
no. Have I given you my card yet? I don't think I did. I only have a few, but I would love to hear from you.
Okay.
So we can stay in touch. I'll be coming back to Prague. And I think I'll be here this summer for about a week or so. It'll be great that we can do
10
that.
years. Before that, I had a Fulbright here,
Oh, wow.
and then I brought Luther students over here like 20
Yep,
years.
yep, yep, yep.
Last summer, I brought an alumni group over here for
Oh,
a
wow.
month.
Wow.
So
That's great.
I really love sharing this place.
That's great. Yeah,
Have
we'd
you been
love.
here before?
I have been here one time, a year and a half ago.
Mhm.
I was here for like 4 days, and this, I've been here a week. Yeah, it's not enough. I mean, even 5 days. You add traveling, and then you add the whole idea of jet lag, and they pressed me. They had a pretty compressed agenda, which is not a good idea because it doesn't even give you time to think or to shop or to see whatever. So
Or
we
to be
didn't.
impressed by the city and the music and the art.
Exactly. Oh yeah. I don't get to see any of that. Right? I just
Well, I hope
basically.
you will this summer.
Me too. Yeah,
No.
definitely. I have to come here in a rush anymore. I have to come in slow.
No.
No, well, if I'm here, you can't go. Here's some of my
Well,
favorite
and
places.
also love to just sit down and talk to a person that talk about civil rights and that. That'll be great.
No, we were living in upstate New York, and believe it or not, there was still a lot of segregation and violence.
Yeah, yeah.
So we integrated
That's New York, right?
restaurants, the fire departments, police department. We really put ourselves, we weren't at risk of anything that was south.
Yeah.
We were very involved.
Oh, I'm sure. That going on.
Yeah, I was just fresh out of college and I was really very lucky to be involved. A lot of older people in the community, lawyers, ministers, and African Americans.
Yeah. Right.
And then Luther has a picture course required of all students, and it always has to do with African.
Which is nice.
I did a lecture for the whole first-year class, 5 minutes, civil rights movement. And I used all those postcards that went to demonstrate the fact that nothing was getting taken care of.
Right. Wasn't being addressed properly in spite of it.
Now it's going backwards and it's
Right.
really depressing. I feel like we got lost.
It's actually getting worse in some ways. We see, like, if you look back at the United States now, and what's going on all over the states, you see that there's been groups of hatred that have come out, and they feel in power now with new rhetoric coming out of Washington. Absolutely. They say a lot of things, they do a lot of things. Even personal experiences, like my sister and my son. My son was to school at Brandeis and so good school, yeah. They have, so because it is a Jewish university that he tells me stories about how he got to them and everything. As my sister is going to college at Harvard, Mass General, she lives in Boston. And she told me the other day that she was on the phone talking to my parents in Spanish. She lived in Latin America. We're first generation. But she was on the phone with them in Spanish. Some guy goes up and says, you know, them, F, Latina, go back to where you came from. And it's just in Boston. So what's going on is you've got a lot of, no, right, it's everywhere. But what I'm saying to you is you've got now this pervasive mindset that it's okay for them to come out. And what's interesting is we've been saying this for years, that this has been going on, but nobody wanted to show their ugly face. Exactly. So, hello. How are you? Very nice to meet you. Too.
You're being taken care of.
I have a meeting.
Manager.
Well, that's our challenge. You have to do something extraordinary to get there.
Yes, it's crazy.
So yeah, it's really cold. No, thank
It's
you.
seriously cold.
Yeah, it's seriously cold.
But we don't have Russian tanks, and we're not with bombs.
Right.
So, I mean, there are some advantages.
That's exactly right. I always, I was born in Nicaragua.
Oh.
And I migrated to the States when I was 12. And I had lived in civil war and communism in Nicaragua. And so I always tell my children, both of whom oftentimes follow the American trajectory of complaining and whining about things that we should not. And so they walk up to me and say, well, Dad, I had a horrible day at the university, my son says to me, and I said to him, let me ask you a question. And he goes, I know what you're going to ask. And I said, first of all, have they shot it? He goes, no. I said, did you have to make a mistake? I said, was there any of you? He said, yes. I said, are you finished the sport? He goes, yes, sir. But you haven't had a good. So tell me,
let me know when this works.
So that's always been my departure point for everything that we talk about.
Well, I think you win every time.
I think so. Hopefully I will continue to win.
Yeah. I mean, you're on the right track.
Yeah, exactly.
So when in doubt, don't check it out. I mean, you're doing fine.
So it's an interesting perspective, but it's been an interesting life. It's been a pandemic. I always tell people, I've been very blessed that I've had the opportunity of being in the classroom, but also being in the field. That's kind of what I'm going to share with you guys today.
Great.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Absolutely. You don't have fans out of the chairs.
That's very nice.
Yeah.
And this is front row. I don't know what you're doing in the front row.
You gotta hang around with it.
Very good. Exactly.
No, let's call it.
There's no question.
You don't want to be behind it. You might miss something good.
And there's a correlation between front row and leaving early.
That's fascinating. I thought usually, not as professors, you understand these things. Is the escape route from the back row or the front row?
It depends on where the door is. But in this case, you're in the front row.
All right, so got it. Be running somewhere. Definitely.
Great to have you.
Great, thank you very much. Here's your card.
Thank you much. Yeah, I have mine up here. So.
I won't confuse your thoughts while you're getting your
It's all good. Yeah, it's all good. You're ready to go.
Okay, I'm gonna get some professional slides, straight. System adjustments, great. How are you doing? Nice to meet you. I know it's what? Oh, very good. Oh, this was the first one. Right. Oh, yeah, they even shut down the skiers on it. Right, exactly. Well, sure. Wonderful. Well, I hope they figure out how to solve it.
You're not on the list.
All right, still happening. Very much, sure.
Political, poetry, poet.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't see the life, but poet.
The interior scholar is not yet what we like.
Also, they ask me about the members of the audience has questions.
Easy shot. Right on. I
deuxième soir. Alors, et il faut demander à l'ambassadeur comment faire. Avec plaisir, avec grand plaisir. À bientôt. Ah oui, salut. Bon, très bien, très bien. Je suis agent américain sur le truc enfin la justice, etc. Oui, ça va. Donc, c'est un bon moment. Quoi? Oui, oui, absolument. Il y a très nouvelles. Ils ont fait passer une nouvelle loi à qui aujourd'hui même pour inaugurer le programme des cours d'anticorruption. C'est absolument nécessaire. Et comme vous savez, il y a deux jours, enfin, la Commission européenne avec les acteurs qui vont débloquer $1 milliard le premier sera en fin de l'été et au début de l'automne. Ouais. Oui, on va pouvoir travailler certainement. Et bon, le truc de l'IMF, c'est dans le chemin. Hein. Ils sont d'accord il y a quelques jours. Oui, on se rappelle. Bon courage, merci beaucoup, madame. Salut à vous deux. Well, that was very nice. And I'm sure it's phone just before. I found our team great fellow, No. But isn't that what good professors are supposed to do? Just go out and study. But it's all
When our presentation is on, then we keep them off. We turn them on. Because of the same thing, which is something. And then afterwards we go to yeah, and then after my slide presentation.
That's not a conference.
It's actually
Oh yeah.
You guys want to count?
It's our one kind of you know, all they said was, if you ever want to see you again. And that wasn't so people left the cover. Well, I think in his case, if you can. Oh, they're there? Great, excellent. Okay, cool.
Being another photographer, you know, I really appreciate the photographers who get the right angles and get the right, you're doing a great job. Thank you. Well, the documentation is great. Without it, I'll see if I can remember this thing in the lecture. It's fascinating.
I like that magic.
Okay. All right. So good evening, everyone. Welcome to the American Center. A little bit of exercise at the beginning. How many of you are here for the first time? Yay! Kudos for that. Excellent. I'm glad to see you in here. I hope that you will leave us with your email and we can send you our monthly program, which has a lot of cool stuff. But anyways, I'm very happy that you came today because today is our pretty much final event, which fell on March 1st, but it's the final event of the Black History Month that we celebrated in the month of February. So we did a lot of events and book screenings, which were focusing on African Americans and other minorities in the United States. And today we're happy to have a very special guest, Dr. Alejandro Carmen, who is from, and I have to read it because it's very long, School of Criminology, Criminal Justice and Strategic Studies at Tarleton State University in Texas, who is very nice to come to the American Center today to share some of his thoughts about police violence, police reform of the justice system in the United States, racial profiling, etc. So he will tell you more about his background, which is really impressive, so be prepared to be impressed. And I think that presentation will take about 30 to 40 minutes, and then you will have a lot of space to ask questions. So think of your questions during the presentation, because if you don't have questions, I will have questions. And then you're going to stay here until 8 o'clock, okay? Anyway, so enjoy, and I hope you will have interesting questions coming up. There will be a lot of food for your brains. And I hope to see you in some of our programs that we're preparing. Okay? So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. It is wonderful to see all of you here today. When I saw the weather forecast for today, I anticipated maybe 2 people that had to be here, as opposed to as many of you that showed up tonight. Mostly because even though civil rights is an interesting topic for most people in the world, the temperature is simply unbearable, especially when you come from Texas like I do. So tomorrow, as you may find this interesting, as I hop on a plane to London and then on to Dallas, I will have a pair of jeans, a t-shirt, and then a jacket. So it seems like I'm in a very dysfunctional environment because when I get to London, I'll have my jacket on. When I get to Dallas, it is about 75 degrees Fahrenheit right now, which is quite warm for us during the month of February. So having said that, it is an honor to be here with you tonight. And also I want to thank, before anything else, to the U.S. Embassy and the American Center. And Jana is actually takes no credit of doing this, but she's done amazing work. And to my colleague in the United States, Dr. Tara Shelley, who was the architect for sort of framing the conversation for tonight, for Ava, for all her attention during the past few days. I think we have her exhausted after so much translation for the past few days, as I've required to do that. I promised her that, in the future I will try to learn Czech. But I've mispronounced a couple of words that have suggested to her that for the sake of U.S. diplomacy, I'd rather not speak it at all. So I'd rather stick to English, Spanish, and a bit of Italian that I speak from time to time. But having said that, I wanted to share with you tonight a little bit about my work and the work that I've done for the past 20 years in the United States. And to give you a little bit of background on myself, I am a Nicaraguan immigrant to the United States. I came to the U.S. at the age of 12 from Nicaragua, and at the young age of 12, I had actually experienced the Civil War and communism. And so to many of you, perhaps not the ones in the audience, but to the older generation, I can relate very well to the statues of Marx and Lenin and various other things that we had to go through. It's amazing when you go through communism, regardless of which part of the world you go through, it's sort of a universal language that is spoken. So my parents, from my father's side, my real last name is Karam, K-A-R-A-M. They're actually descendants of Lebanon. Both my grandparents have descendancy of Lebanon. My grandmother came in through Ellis Island, New York, and then my grandfather in New York. They had changed their last name so people in Latin America could pronounce it. And so I'm half Lebanese, and from my mother's side, their last name is Amaya, which puts them in the Basque region of Spain. So oftentimes in my cuisine, I have either ham, cheese, manchego, a glass of wine, and oftentimes the wonderful menu of the Middle East. So I was by default, already born in a multicultural environment. And then I moved to the United States very young with my sister, and began to have some interest in the area of civil rights. And when I went to the university, to Florida State, where I finished my PhD in criminology, I had absolutely no idea that civil rights was going to have the center stage in my field of study, as it has been clearly for the last 20 and 30 years, particularly in the courts and in law enforcement alone. I tell you a little bit before I give you my official introduction that what you will find in my background is that I'm more so than just a typical professor. And what I mean by that is I don't believe that we professors should be in the classroom teaching all day long and then writing books all afternoon, which, by the way, I've done both. I've written the books and written the articles and been in universities that are publish or perish and taught thousands of courses, right? But at the same time, I believe that when we talk about civil rights particularly, it's not just a matter of writing about it and theorizing it from the warmth of your office, but also being out in the field, right? And being out there and actually working with people to try to make it into a better environment. And I'll tell you a quick story which is not captured in my bio. Back in 2001, right before 9/11, I was sitting in my office already, by the way, developing what we now conceive as racial profiling in law enforcement. I was one of the first criminologists in the US to actually do a study on a police department on what we now call bias-based policing. And so I remember clearly being in my office and receiving a call from a lady that said to me, "We'd like to hear you talk about racial profiling." And we academics, and those of you that are colleagues of mine in this room, you'll appreciate what I'm about to tell you. We love the idea of speaking. So typically it's because no one at home will listen to us. So if you give us an opportunity, i.e. tonight, to have a forum of people that are semi-interested in what you do, we find that to not only be great, but we're also, it's rehabilitative for us. I mean, clearly, as a colleague of mine that graduated from Oxford said to me one day, he said, "We are nothing more than frustrated actors and actresses, in a public forum, trying to display ourselves before a captive audience." So at the very least, for a few seconds, you'll be captive, and I'll tell you the story. So this woman comes to my office, and we're alone with a young man, and she says to me, "Well, what do you know about racial profiling?" And I said, "Well, clearly I need a podium. I need to talk to you and be in the audience." So there were two people in the audience, which were awake, which typically, by the way, is not necessarily different from my classes, except there was no one else in the audience at the time. And so they were paying attention to what I was saying, and they were very engaged. They asked me a few questions about my research, and the other, they left. And because sometimes, as I often say to my students, we don't know what we don't know, right? So they left and they moved on, and I received a call. And the call said, "You're hired." And I said, "Well, what do you mean you're hired? I have a job, I'm tenured, I'm a professor, I can't, go work." I said, "I realized this was a job interview." And she says, "No, you're hired to teach all the chiefs of police in the state of Texas on racial profiling." And I said, what could possibly go wrong with that? Clearly I'm a first-generation immigrant, with a multicultural background, to go teach a whole bunch of chiefs of police that are rather conservative, but they'll clearly change their mind when I go and teach them because, of what I do, right? And by the way, much in the same way as oftentimes we make commitments and we say yes and then we sort of regret that, I said, of course I will. And then I had no idea what they were going to pay, what exactly this meant, but I began to get ready for my new journey. And as of today, in fact, I'll be there on Monday teaching another batch of 85 new chiefs of police. As of today, the records show that I have trained over 5,000 police chiefs in Texas since 2001, and I've trained over 20,000 police officers in the state of Texas and throughout the U.S. for the past 20 years. And so what I decided to do, thank you, but that's not necessary. I'm not trying to impress you, but rather give you context of my presentation because it's about real life. It's not about, theoretical forums that we often talk about. And so what ended up happening after that is I then received another invitation. So I've testified in court, I've testified in federal cases on racial profiling, and I've also engaged in doing work outside, consulting with, I currently consult with about 150 law enforcement agencies throughout the U.S., some of which are federal government agencies, the FBI included, and then also local law enforcement. And so I'm very busy on a plane oftentimes and keep my academic job still because I think our university graciously has said, do it all and connect it all to what we do at the university, which I commend them for that. But about 5 years ago, I received an invitation from a law firm, the second largest law firm in the United States, Sheppard Mullin, to be part of a bid to compete for what they called a police reform case. And I said, of course, put my name down, and I often say yes, right? I said, of course, you often get the yes for me. So they received my visa, they included it in part of the proposal, and believe it or not, we actually won the bid. Right? So I was very excited about something I had absolutely no idea what he was going to commit me to, except that I was going to go to the beautiful city of New Orleans once a month and work with police officers. And as it turns out, and I'll explain during my presentation, I ended up actually being in charge of the police academy, right? Which everything begins at the police academy and everything ends at the police academy, right? So no small task. But the police department in New Orleans entered into what's called a consent decree, which I'm going to talk about that tonight. And so what that means is that once a consent decree is entered, they have to have oversight from the U.S. federal court. And there were 6 of us, were selected by the United States Department of Justice, by the federal court, and the police had to agree, whether reluctantly or not, to actually have us basically oversee the police department. And for those of you in policing, so you understand the context of the power that we have and the authority that we have credentials that say federal monitor. And we walk into a building at a police department and we say to them, I want to see that file, I want to see that file. And they immediately have to surrender keys, give you access to everything and anything that you want to have access to. We also enjoy the immunity of the United States federal system, which means that we are federal agents on behalf of the court. So if something happens to us, it's almost as if you are hurting, not almost, but it is as if you're hurting or killing a federal agent. An FBI agent has the same degree of immunity that I would in a case, right? So I did this for 3 years, and then I said, well, okay, I'm done with my part, I'm going to move on, and I took a break. My colleagues laughed, and they said, that's going to last about a week. And I said, no, really, I'm really done with this. I'm going to move on to other things. I continue to do all this work with, in writing and teaching and training police officers. And then the judge from Puerto Rico called me and said, Dr. Del Carmen, we need you here. And Puerto Rico, in case you don't know, is part of the U.S. territory, of course, but it's part of the U.S. quote-unquote, jurisdiction. But it also has the second largest police department in the United States. It has 15,000 police officers. 15,000 police officers. And so they report to one person. Right? So imagine the scope of work. And he said to me, but don't worry, it's only 10 years. And I said, 10 years? And he says, yeah. So you get to travel to Puerto Rico, you get to go to Puerto Rico 1 week out of every month, and I'm going to give you the judge says to me, an area, which is, a good area for you. And I said, okay, well, you wonder sort of what that is, It's like when people say to you, but don't worry, it's not going to hurt, It's like, well, that's not true, And so he says to me, you're going to have a great area. And that area is going to be, he said, and then he pauses, he goes, internal affairs. And so I kind of thought about it for a second. I said, well, that's kind of neat, the internal affairs. And I said, let me just ask you a question. How many complaints do they get a year? He said, well, only 17,000. And so obviously that if you do the math, it's one complaint per officer, and a bit more. So I accepted. He accepted the job, and I'm now one of the federal monitors in Puerto Rico. And then to add insult to injury, he decided to appoint me to yet another case, which has to do with healthcare, which I know nothing about, but he felt that my statistical background could help him in the course of doing that as well. So I am one, I believe, of like a very selective club of people in the U.S. of about 7 or maybe 8 of us that actually have had experience with more than one consent decree in the U.S. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and particularly as it relates to the courts, because there's been a whole component of the court system that we have seen recently. So without going through every line, for I'm not good at doing that, I will tell you that I have been around for, like I said, 20 years, and I serve in the capacity of the executive director of the School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, and Jana said, Strategic Studies at Tarleton State University. That just means I have a lot of responsibilities, that most of which relate to criminal justice, public administration, the Corps of Cadets, and 5 institutes that study all the way from cybercrime, all the way to victims advocacy, as we are entrenched, literally in the web of victims advocacy in the United States. So this is some of my media shots, and I'm going to go through this very quickly so you don't see me oftentimes, but I am often in CNN and also Univision. A few days ago I had a Univision interview, and this shows you, by the way, the desperation among my Spanish-speaking colleagues that they have to go to me for a shooting that took place, sadly, in our country a few weeks ago. And the Nielsen rating came back with 550,000 people only that watched the interview. And what my mother said to her when I called her, I was trying to impress her still to this day, 50 years after she gave birth to me. And I said, Mom, I said, 500,000 people saw me. And she says, yes, but your tie was off. And so clearly, as my mother will likely watch this at some point, I will tell you that I've got the bow tie, Mom, so, it's safe, So having said that, let me tell you a little bit now, seriously, transitioning to why I'm here, right? So in the United States, back in 1994, President Bill Clinton enacted what we now call the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, right? So this act was very significant. By the way, it had been worked on for 10 years. In America, we don't do things very quickly, right? So it was something that they worked on for 10 years. And what this act basically responded to was declining crime rates that were taking place in the U.S. So a lot of police chiefs, a lot of local politicians were very concerned about the crime rate and how much it was escalating throughout the U.S. So they basically decided, this is, by the way, not very well known. The act is, but not what I'm about to tell you, which is kind of interesting. And I thought that you would find it fascinating. So the act comes into play. Bill Clinton signs it into law, right? He says, we are going to execute this act. This is a good thing for the United States, right? Ronald Reagan used to always say, because Reagan used a lot of humor, in his speeches, he used to say that when somebody knocks on your door and says, hello, I am here from the government, and I'm here to help you, that he used to say that those are the most oxymoronic terms in the English vocabulary that a human being could ever hear. And so what we didn't know that this act not only gave us free money, which everybody was very excited about, that we were getting all these grants and all this money, but also came with some responsibility. All right, imagine that. And, by the way, some jurisdiction that was also being enacted within the act. And so when the act was passed, it came with, listen carefully, $30 billion. Now, that's billion, not million, B with a B, the ones we like, right? $30 billion that went straight to fund crime prevention strategies and law enforcement strategies across the United States. To give you an idea of the magnitude of the impact of this, in the U.S. currently, there are approximately 25,000 law enforcement agencies. 25,000. The FBI estimates that today at 10:30 in the morning Texas time, there are 1 million police officers in the streets of the United States today. That gives you a sort of an idea of the magnitude of our law enforcement entity in the US, right? That does include local, federal, state, and whatnot, right? So the act is passed, and they sort of funnel all this money to all of these entities. And then this project took 10 years. In 6 years, they put it all together, and it became very controversial, right? Because it also put 1 million police officers in the streets, right? So it implemented it. 3 strikes, you're out. I don't know if you know what this is, but 3 strikes is the new law that came into play, that if you committed the same violent act 3 times, you were going to go to prison for the rest of your life, right? So the idea, by the way, the rationale behind this was that most of the crime is committed by a very selective group of people. So if you can incarcerate those very few selected group of people, that somehow you're going to address crime. By the way, I'm not telling you I'm a fan at all, right? So in fact, we criminologists think that that's absolutely baloney, and it's not something that's real. But politicians felt, because they know best, that clearly, you can tell I'm an American, right? Because, we often say this, but, that at the end of the day, this was clearly the solution to our crime problem, was to put away what we call recidivists, the repeat offenders, right? In addition to that, they funded 100,000 police officers in the streets of America. And the way this worked, by the way, that is, if you were a chief of police, you could actually say, I want 10 police officers. So you wrote a letter to Washington, to the Department of Justice. They would actually give you the money to fund your 10 police officers for X number of years. So like, for instance, you could fund a police officer for 3 years, and then after the 3rd year, the thinking of the chief was that after the 3rd year, that he or she could go to your city council or to your boss and say, hey, we have this 10 new people, and we're not going to just let them go, so give me the money to be able to pay, for them to stay, right? So the idea is it's a temporary, sort of idea of bringing in police officers so that eventually you will have this permanent addition to your police department. And by the way, most police departments in the US, received some degree of funding to hire new police officers. Now, $9.7 billion actually went to prison funding, right? Particularly as it relates to expanding the death penalty eligible offenses. And so the idea was that if when we mean by death eligible in the state of Texas, and I'm sure all of you have heard about the state of Texas, right? That the state of Texas were very punitive, in the sense that we put people away for a long time, right? So what we mean by death penalty cases are cases where, in fact, you would be eligible to the death penalty if, in fact, you committed a certain act. So they expanded, all right, the scope of these death penalty cases. One of them, by the way, is if you kill a police officer, right? So in Texas, if you kill a police officer, you might as well write yourself a death sentence. You will die, right? So they will prosecute you for killing a police officer, and it's a matter of time before you will actually be sentenced. And just as an FYI, I don't want to get too much off topic, but it takes an average, and for the judge you'll find this interesting, it takes an average of 8 to 10 years to finally execute somebody once they've actually been convicted of the death penalty. So it's a fascinating concept. And just so you know, from a contextual perspective, in Texas, we execute more people in a given year than all of the states that execute put together. So that just sort of gives you a sense of that, right? And I often, by the way, when my students are fanatical about the death penalty, I often say that in England, the public executions ended as a result of the fact that there were, at the time that the public executions were taking place, over 200 offenses in England that were punishable by death, right? So you all know, I tell you as Europeans that you are, for the most part, that in England they would have the public executions, read the decree from the king or the queen to show the magnitude and force of the monarchy. And then once the person lost their head, among other things, then clearly everyone saw and could clearly be deterred from committing the same act. One of the reasons why they ended the death penalty in a public forum is because pickpocketing took place, which, by the way, listen carefully, was an executable offense. So when people say that the death penalty deters crime, well, of course it does. It's been doing that for years now. That's why we're pickpocketing. So we also had $6.1 billion to fund prevention programs, and this is the most important line of my entire presentation. It established 42 USC 14141. And if you're a student in this room, or if you're curious about our system of reforming the US, you have to look this up. This is very, very important. This particular U.S. code, people miss this all the time. They talk about everything else that I just talked about, but they don't talk about the USC, 42 USC 14141. This particular code, which is a federal code that was enacted as part of this bill, it actually, listen carefully, gave the right to the United States government to investigate and also to sue any police and court entity in the U.S. that was found to have issues related to civil rights. It's very important that you know this, because this gave the authority for the federal government to come in and actually do this. Keep in mind that in the U.S., and I know all of you know the history of the U.S. probably better than most of us, but I will tell you that keep in mind that in the U.S. there's a constant debate between state rights and federalism, right? And some states, like my home state of Texas, we want nothing to do with the federal government. That's sort of our attitude, right? And you may not know this, by the way, but for you students, so that you can go home proudly and say, I learned something new from this talk that I thought I was going to be really bored out of my mind today, but I learned something new and sort of profess to your professors that you know this. In the United States, out of all of our 50 states, the only state in the U.S. that can fly the state flag at the same level as the U.S. flag is Texas. And so when you land in Texas, you're not landing in the U.S., you're landing in Texas. And Texas will oftentimes remind you that you are landing in, my son, who goes to school at Brandeis in Boston, he often sends me a text, when I land in Boston, and he says, welcome to the Commonwealth. And so when he lands in Texas, I often text him and I say, welcome to the Republic. Because clearly there is a marked difference, and we're very proud people in Texas, right? So you can insult anybody you want, but do not insult Texas, right? So USC code 14141 is very, very, very interesting. Because what this does, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but what it does is it gives the federal government, the Attorney General, the power to do this. Now, Bill Clinton was a sort of central Democrat, as I think a lot of historians will call it, right? And then, of course, after Clinton, we had George Bush, 43, and then we had 9/11, which really swung the pendulum, to the other side. There's a famous scholar, by the way, that his name is Herbert Packer. And Packer, in the 1962 Harvard Law Review, talked about how every society just sort of shifts. Particularly the U.S., we have sort of due process on the one hand, and then we have crime control. And it sort of shifts back and forth between, these two throughout the pendulum. Clearly, 9/11, September the 11th, 2001, was one pendulum that we shifted clearly towards crime control, almost disobeying the idea of due process. And if you want factual evidence of this, you can look at the U.S. Patriot Act in itself, where the President of the United States has the authority of taking away the U.S. citizenship from any U.S. citizen that would be deemed terrorist. And so we Americans would have never thought about that until 9/11 took place, because it really affected the core of who we were in an emotional component. I wrote an article back then about how we responded emotionally to a very historical component that obviously in history will judge us one way or another on 9/11, but I think a lot of it has to do with that. So when you look at this particular bill, we had the conservative movement, i.e. George Bush 43, where we were fighting terrorism, where we were doing all this stuff. So no one really focused on the local law enforcement component, right? But after Bush, we elected a man by the name of Barack Obama. I think some of you may be familiar, right? Because he's been here to Prague. And so President Obama came, and Obama basically had in my view, had a very academic approach, right, to government. Very cerebral, very bright, had a very academic approach to this. And he named a guy that I know, by the way, very well, by the name of Eric Holder to become the Attorney General of the United States. In fact, I had the privilege of inviting him to my university at the time to come, and he accepted the invitation, came with Valerie Jarrett, who was the right-hand person of the president, who, in fact, by the way, lives with the Obamas now in Washington. But Valerie Jarrett, Eric Holder came, and Eric Holder had been appointed, believe it or not, by Republican presidents, and sort of, had governed through various points of democracy, in our democracy, through Republicans and Democrats. But Eric Holder said something that really set the tone for what I'm about to present to you tonight, the core of my presentation. He called the United States Department of Justice the jewel, the Civil Rights Division, the jewel of the Department of Justice. And so in other words, out of all the things that we do in the US DOJ, out of all the things that we do as part of the Attorney General of the United States, the Civil Rights Group are the jewel of what we do. And that really set the tone for what I'm about to tell you, which was that for years, And let me put this in historical context. For years, we have, in the U.S., we have been fighting civil rights. And you know, this is no news flash to anyone in this room, right? So we had the Civil Rights Act, we had, you know, civil rights issues, we had a lot of suspicions that in many ways, and some of it was anecdotal evidence, that racism continued to be, right? But interestingly enough, we had the Rodney King incident in Los Angeles, where people finally, and for those of you millennials in this room, it's clearly a shock to you that back in the day we had no phones, right? And no cell phones, and no ability to record anyone, right? And so there are states in the U.S., believe it or not, like Texas, that have what we call one-party consent states. And what a one-party consent state means, listen carefully to those of you that are from the Czech Republic, this is fascinating. We can actually pull out our phone and record, and we do not need your permission to do so. Oh. So the ultimate democracy, right? You pull out your cell, click on record, I'm recording. As long as the expectation of privacy in the streets is known, then I can do this, right? And so my point is, back then we had no cell phones, we didn't have the ability, we did have, but they looked like a brick, and only very rich people could afford it, and those people in Hollywood, right? So, but here's Rodney King that is beaten up badly, severely, by a group of police officers in Los Angeles, and someone is recording the entire incident. And so it really hit the fabric for the U.S. where everybody got a chance to see. Americans, we're good people. We are generous people. And we're also people that really love what we do and love our country. Whether you're on the right side or the left side or in the middle, we love our democracy. In fact, the most powerful thing about our country, in years of doing this, and I still get goosebumps when I say this, is that there is a document that begins with "we the people," and that is our Constitution. And that document to us is sacred, because it doesn't begin with you, the government. It doesn't begin with you, the tax collector. It doesn't begin with you, the police. It says, "we the people of the United States." And so we believe, we Americans, are ingrained in our hearts and in our fiber, that we believe that when we go to an embassy like this one, the embassy works for us. We don't work for the embassy. We're not impressed by government. Government is an extension of our taxes. It's a fascinating concept. Because in other parts of the world, some of which I come from, government is like, oh wow, we're in government. In America, we look at government and we say, so what are you doing for me? Because I'm paying a lot of money for you. Every year I pay a lot of tax money for you. So you better start acting up. Like today, for instance, when I came to the embassy. They were running, they removed my passport, which is always kind of uncomfortable, I was outside in the cold, and I was with Ava, they were waiting, and as they were running, I guess, 65,000 background checks, which by the way, had already been run before, so you're good. But they had no idea, and I appreciate the security doing this. As I was standing outside, I began to think, I'm like, oh my gosh, we Americans are so spoiled, because we expect to just walk right into our embassy. And I said, excuse me, this is our embassy, this is U.S. turf, U.S. territory, this belongs to us. And you work for me, So it's kind of a very interesting dynamic. But you have to understand the context of that. Because this USC code actually gives the right to the Attorney General to then sue, right? To sue. And so, all the law enforcement entities. So listen to this, and I wanted to quote this. This is very important. The United States Department of Justice agrees on this concept, which is, those of you that are students, this is fascinating, especially in the legal field. Patterns and practices. Patterns and practices. Which basically means that the investigation is launched by US DOJ. They investigate a police department. But we always look for this concept of patterns and practices. That means that you've been sort of doing the same thing over and over again. You remember your parents, if you're honest, that at some point your parents said, it's not that you did this one time. You did this several times, and therefore you're going to be punished, right? So the idea is your patterns and practices. Those of you in relationships, right? So you know that your spouse or your partner, if they do something consistently, especially ladies in this room, you would look at somebody if you are with a male, a companion, you would look at your male companion and say, it's not the first time you do this, Boy, have we heard that before, right? So the idea is, that's patterns and practices, right? So Terry's just like, yeah, I've been there, man. I'm with you. So the point is, patterns and practices. So the idea is, US DOJ goes into your police department and they begin to investigate whether or not police officers have been corrupt, whether or not police officers have been doing this consistently. And there's a concept that I don't have here, which is called deliberate indifference. Deliberate indifference. And what that means is, what does that mean in English? It means that you have been indifferent deliberately. If I'm indifferent to this bottle of water, that simply means that I'm walking past the bottle of water and I'm ignoring that it's there. If I am deliberately indifferent to that bottle of water, it means that I have deliberately passed the water and I have looked because it wasn't by accident. It's that I've done this several times, but I do not even recognize that that bottle of water is here. And so deliberate indifference and the whole idea of patterns and practices became the two legal standards for the United States Department of Justice to actually investigate. And so, listen to this. It opened up 11 new patterns and practices cases in the U.S. And the next sentence is even more powerful. It negotiated 19 police reform cases in the United States. So what does that mean? That means that cities like Seattle, Albuquerque, New Orleans, Puerto Rico, right, San Juan, Newark, New Jersey, Cleveland, Ohio, all of LA, Los Angeles, all of these cities fell under the agreement with the Department of Justice. And by the way, once the USDOJ investigated it, they would show up and say, "Hi, Will, we're from the USDOJ, and we would like to talk to you." By the way, most chiefs, when they get a note that USDOJ is coming, civil rights, they don't sleep the night before. You know, this is not a pleasant visit, typically. That you get the government to show up and say, "Excuse me, we think you're great." You know, that doesn't happen, right? So they'll show up and they'll say, "You know, we would like to sit down and talk to you." Okay? So we did an investigation into your patterns and practices. By the way, that right there means getting a really good lawyer, because you're going to need it, you know? And so we did an investigation into patterns and practices, and we found X number of cases where we feel that your police department has violated the civil rights of individuals, right? And so, by the way, that also includes the court, which I'm about to transition to that. So it does involve the court. And so what that means is that the police, they have evidence. And by the way, it's not like a little report, like a 5-page memo. These are, and you can Google these, by the way, these are hundreds of pages of detailed information, of cases that they've reviewed, people that they have interviewed, video that they have captured, that shows not just some suggestive evidence, but evidence that would stand in a court of law that suggests that your police department has been violating the civil rights of good, innocent Americans. Which, by the way, in the United States, is probably one of the biggest sins that government can commit. Because that means that you are depriving an American of his or her constitutional rights. I want you to understand that. For us, that's like the worst thing that you could do to a human being, right? And so the magnitude is pretty impactful. Some cities, interestingly enough, reacted to this by simply saying, "So what are your options? What are the options?" And the government says, "Well, we'd like for you to voluntarily enter into a reform case." And guess what government says? "Of course we will." By the way, the smart ones said that. The not so smart ones that had their egos sort of precede, their logic, guess what they said? They said, "Well, we'd like to fight you in court because we think we're going to win this case." Now, think about this for a second. Now, think about it for 1 second. This is the United States of America with the resources of the entire government of the most powerful nation in the world. Are you with me? Now, you don't have to be a PhD or a lawyer or a judge to really figure out that it's probably in your best interest to not fight an entity that has unlimited resources. But some did. And on the footsteps of the court, going into the courtroom, the city attorneys would turn around to USDOJ lawyers, by the way, many of whom are graduates, I know a lot of them, many of whom are graduates of Georgetown Law, Harvard Law, Princeton Law, and these are the best and the brightest of our country, right? And so they walk with their heavy briefcases, and they meet in the footsteps of the court and they say, "Let's just settle this." And the USDOJ smiles and says, "Sure." And so at that point, they settle the case. They enter into an agreement. And by the way, the agreements, oftentimes, and these are all Googleable so you can find these, are probably between 200 and 500 pages long, single-spaced. And what this means is every aspect of policing, every aspect of the court is reformed. So it's not just like we're going to concentrate on the academy, or we're going to concentrate on recruitment because you don't have enough diversity in your recruitment, or we're going to concentrate on training, or we're going to concentrate on legal classes. This is a reform that is the most inclusive of all reforms in a police department management, hiring, firing, investigations, domestic violence cases. Everything you can ever imagine on police work goes into this. And by the way, I will tell you this also, that at the end of the day, the investigations are so thorough that oftentimes we, and I'll tell you what, where my role comes in, we have to look at these and interpret what a lot of those sentences are. If you ever want to know historically, the most extensive of all of the consent decrees in U.S. history is in Puerto Rico. So obviously I wanted to have some time off, so I decided to be part of this historical, consent decree. It is not only extensive in terms of length, but also in terms of years. It's a 10-year consent decree. And so it is the longest one in U.S. history. Now, I will tell you, in case you're wondering, money, right? So where does the money come from? Federal government does not give you the money. So if you're thinking, the government must write you a very fat check until you go change your police department, it actually comes from the budget of every city that has been sued. And just in case you're wondering, is it a small fee? Is it, maybe $10,000? Is it $20,000? They typically range from $1 million to about maybe $80 or $100 million. So it's quite a bit of money, right? So then what happens afterwards is they negotiated 19 of them, and what that means is that the court elects a group of people, typically 6 of them, to actually, and we, as I mentioned earlier, we become federal monitors, and we're actually deployed to the scene. And we write reports for the judge. Like there's a lead federal monitor that I report to, and then we write a report, and that report actually goes into the court's records. And we are officers of the court. We don't work for USDOJ. USDOJ is a party. That's how the court sees it, right? The police department is another party in the lawsuit. Sometimes you have the ACLU that will come in, American Civil Liberties Union, that will come in as well. But we as federal monitors, we don't work for the USDOJ. We do not work for the ACLU. We do not work for the police department. We work for the federal court. And so our job is to go in there. We are the eyes and the ears of the federal judge. And in case you want to know who our federal judges are, our federal judges are appointed by the President of the United States for a lifetime appointment. And they are confirmed by the U.S. Senate. These people are very important people in my country, right? So, having said that, Michael Brown died in Ferguson. I think all of you know the story, so I'm not going to extend it. And for the brevity of time, I always promise my colleagues, and in this case, that I was going to be brief. That just never happens, right? But so Michael Brown died by a police officer, Darren Wilson, on August 9th, 2014. Why this is important is because Michael Brown's death led to civil unrest. And by the way, 3 times in Ferguson, right? So it took place within a year. They had 3 different, explosive protests, and then across the country, there was a sense of heaviness that we carried in our country about what had happened to Michael Brown. It brought national and international attention to the issue of constitutional policing, and immediately DOJ civil rights descended. In fact, there are a couple of people that I was with last week or a week and a half ago that are the investigators, so the people that were there in the trenches in Ferguson. And so what ended up happening is it focused on police corruption, right? And so the idea of, if you look at the DOJ report, most of it has to do with police. But this is where the court comes in. In addition to the police issues, and I will tell you that in the case of Michael Brown, they did not indict the officer. They did not indict him. They did not prosecute him because they felt that not enough evidence rose to the level of the officer being prosecuted. Whether you agree or not is a different story. But the bottom line is there was no prosecutorial component either at the state level or at the federal level. But the report becomes important because in the report there are 2 chapters. One primarily devoted to the court reform. And what they found on the court stuff, this is a municipal court that operated out of Ferguson, Missouri. It really revolutionized the way the court does its business in today's world in the United States, right? So what it did do is the court primarily used its judicial authority as a means to compel payment. So in other words, to advance the city's financial interest. In other words, they were charging defendants money so that they could actually give the money to the city so that they could run the other services. So it became like more of a police officers go out and give people a lot of tickets today because we need money. Think about it. It became a money-making venue right? So what they would often do is the mindset was to a police officer, Ava, that's a terrifying thought, police officer Ava, we feel that somehow you haven't brought enough money today to be able to do this, so you must go out and stop another 5 people. So it wasn't the infraction, or it wasn't the enforcement, or the idea of providing some sort of a safety net. The culprit and the engine behind this was nothing more than the idea of being able to generate money in order to be able to do this. So it was a horrible finding, right? Then also, the court violated the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which, by the way, for us, is due process and equal protection. Some people argue, and I agree, that it's one of the most important amendments of our Constitution, right? Which is the one that guarantees that you are not automatically guilty, that you have a due process, a process by which you are going to be presumed innocent until proven otherwise. The idea that it is the government that is going to have to demonstrate the burden of proof in order to be able to find you guilty in a court of law. And also, by the way, the courts, they went into discrepancies on minorities. And they found, the US DOJ found, that African Americans, they were having an unnecessary harm placed on them as well as a result of what the court actually found. Now, I'll give you an example, right? So, if somebody got a ticket for a citation or a penalty for not having a driver's license, right, when they were stopped by a police officer. Like the person who showed up, these are people that are poor, that don't have any money, all right, and the infraction was for like $200 US. And so the person shows up to the court, trembling in fear, to go pay, maybe get on a payment plan to pay $20 a month, you know, over the course of X number of months to be able to pay for this. The actual court would say to that person, so how did you get here? And the person would say, well, I drove. And they would say, well, you don't have a license. So that's another ticket for another $200. So they imposed penalty over penalty. And they actually gave people interest rates that were higher than banks. And so the idea was that you could get in debt, and there were cases that they actually did the actual case studies on. There were cases where the infraction maybe would have been $100 that ended up being thousands of dollars. Which, by the way, for folks that don't make money, that are poor in the US, it's the same thing as if I told you that you owe me €1,000,000 today. Right? So it's an amount that is unpayable. And then oftentimes what they would do is that debt would turn automatically into a warrant in some cases. So then if you're stopped by a police officer in the street, you're automatically arrested and taken into custody because of this automatic transference. And what they found is that the court was more punitive towards African Americans than Caucasians and other. And by the way, Hispanics were also included in that as well, right? So they found that this had an actual effect. And I'm almost done here, but to highlight this point, this had a rippling effect throughout the United States. Because what the Ferguson court case did is, at the time, the Attorney General Lynch, she actually issued a letter to all the municipalities in the U.S., to all of the courtrooms, and he basically said to the judges, you better not be doing this. Because if you are, guess what US DOJ is going to do? The same thing we do to cops. We're going to come into your court, and we're going to sue you, and we're going to take you to court. And I will tell you that currently, right now, under the President of the United States, Trump, all right, we have an Attorney General right now that the first thing that he said was that these consent decrees had to sort of go away because he was supportive of policing, right? So change the entire paradigm of what we have done for 8 years. And I will tell you, people are shocked when I tell them this, that these things are actually continuing, right? Not at the pace that they did under President Obama, but they're still continuing in terms of police reform, right? The investigations continue. These letters continue to actually go to these municipalities. And what is fascinating is that as US DOJ has taken more of a dormant role because of the political administration, guess what surged now, to take on that role? ACLU, NAACP, LULAC, and these are all minority groups. And in addition to that, the special, what we call non-profit groups that are sort of think tanks, on civil rights. They're actually the ones suing, and I know this personally because there's been a couple of cities in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that have recently been sued as a result of their court practices, following the Patterson practices investigation of Ferguson, the same model, so to speak, where the judges are then sometimes indicted, other times they're actually sued, they're referred to the ethics committee that we have because they have actually allowed for all of these things to happen in their courtroom as well. So clearly, this open records, we have these open records, I don't know if you're familiar with that concept, but in the US, everything that you do, if you're a government official, is subject to open records. Okay? Now listen to this, right? This is going to blow your mind perhaps. That what happens is if you're working for like a city, Jana is working for a city and she sends me an email. And the email says, we should tax people more, And I respond to her and say, I agree. So let's begin to do this. We'll both go to jail, Jana. And so at the end of the day, somebody that says, we suspect that Jana and Alex are really just, they're really just, behind this operation of charging people more money. And they do what's called a Freedom of Information Act request. Right? And what this means is that they send you a letter. And the letter says, we would like to get Janice's emails for the past year. And Janice says, wait a minute. I have like my doctor's appointments in there and all that. You know what they'll tell you? They'll say, well, too bad because you shouldn't have. Everything you put in that email, because that email account is owned by the taxpayers, is going to the taxpayers. And this is fascinating. The only exception to that rule is if the information is classified. And we're seeing a little bit of that in Washington right now, right? So, but everything else is subject to, so the media oftentimes, they'll send an open records request for like the past 5 years of emails between the chief of police or a judge working for a municipality and somebody else. They'll grab 5 years and they'll have a whole bunch of graduate students go through all the documents to see if they fish for something interesting that's there that will make the 5 o'clock news. Kid you not. That's what democracy does, right? So at the end of the day, they went on and they did all these open records on the courts and they found these disparities, right? So this particular jurisdiction, this case study that I'm going to highlight very quickly is in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I'm not going to tell you the name of the city, but I will tell you that it's a very wealthy city. The population is mostly Caucasian. And most of the people that are transient through the city are people that don't live in the city, right? So they become subjects to the law enforcement entity because we have major highways, kind of like you here in Prague, where you have these folks that come in from other parts of the Czech Republic to work here, and they commute, right, on a daily basis. I know this is not an open forum for complaints on traffic flow, but clearly, people come to Prague in the morning and they leave Prague in the evening to go back home. So police officers are subject to people coming in from other parts of the metroplex, as we call it. So what I did is I was hired, and this is very important for those of you in this room that are studying law or criminology, right? So I'm a little biased in my discipline, I will tell you that, because I love what I do, as you can tell, I'm just very passionate about being a criminologist. And it's interesting because criminology, although it started in Italy, we've had sort of a 60-year experience in modern times, working, and nobody really understands what we do. We tell people we're criminologists. I know my parents, like my dad, who's an architect, very educated guy, speaks 4 languages, lived in Europe, with his master's degrees in Belgium and Italy. Like, he walked up to me and he goes, what exactly did you study? And I said, I'm a criminologist. He goes, so is that a lawyer? And I said, actually, and I don't mean any disrespect to lawyers in the U.S. particularly, but I said, no, lawyers study 4 years undergrad, 3 years of law school. So that's 7, right? So we criminologists study 10. And we're actually doctors, And he says, well, so what do you do? I said, well, I sort of work with cops, Dad. He goes, well, so you're a cop? And I said, no, not really. And so he's still trying to figure it out, But when he watches CNN make a comment about civil rights or terrorism, he's something like, oh yeah, I think I get what you do, In whatever you do, I think you're famous. That's good, So that's but the point is that we criminologists sort of found a niche in crime. And so we came on board and we began to do these assessments. And this court, they called me out and said, look, you've been working on civil rights stuff for years. We want you to look at us. And I commend them for that, because that was very courageous. For a guy like me to come in, I'm not a Texan by birth, but I fit right in. I say it like it is. Some of my friends in this room know I'm a direct shooter. I don't walk around with much diplomacy. As I told one of the embassy officials today, I would have failed my first test at the State Department. I probably would have fit more in either civil rights or Department of Defense. One of the two. So most Texans we qualify in those realms. And so at the end of the day, I went in there and I began to look at their stuff. And I told them, I said, if you hire me to do this, I am going to look at it and I'm going to tell you how it is. I'm not going to come here and give you a very rosy, you know, a very wonderful picture of this if you're in fact doing something wrong. And to their credit, they said, we don't fear it, just go ahead and do it. We began to do the study and we did an assessment. And those of you that dread your statistics courses, I will tell you that they're the most important courses that you will take in graduate school. Because people like, not only people like me, teaching, I often say to my students that when I come in and teach statistics, they look at me and they go, oh my God, that's like drinking poison, you know? And so now you have the carbon teaching your statistics, so it's a matter of which poison you want to drink out of first, you know? But the point is that we review the data. So we actually access the data, we assess the data, and the core policies, what we found is that the core policies were dated, they were very old, they were not current. We also found that the processing system, the way, the collection of data was not accurate. I'll give you an example. We have thousands, millions of undocumented people in the U.S., as you know, and this is not a popular concept in the U.S. And by the way, it is the case now in Europe, you know, sadly enough, you know, for the oldest continent, you know, but one of them. But the issue is that, you know, in Texas, you would find a case such as this court, where somebody could come in and is undocumented. And is stopped by a police officer. And the police officer says, you know, I would like to see, they don't ask for their papers, they say, can I see your driver's license? So undocumented people in Texas are not allowed to have their licenses renewed. They're not. And the reason why is because when you go to the driver's license office, you have to show proof of citizenship. And so it's very sad. So a lot of undocumented people have their driver's licenses, they take it out, and it's clearly expired. So they show it to the police officer. The police officer then at that point writes them a ticket and gives it to them, right? So the person goes to court fearful because it's still government, you know? So you go to court and you say, Your Honor, here's my citation. It was because my driver's license was expired. Typically, most judges in the U.S., municipal judges will tell you and will say to that person, I tell you what, this is the first time that I'll give you a ticket on this. So I'm going to give you an opportunity, go back to the office, to the government office, DPS, and get your license renewed. And if you get your license renewed, you only pay 20% of the penalty. Guess what this person will say? I can't do it. And they will say, because I'm undocumented, if you're saying that, so they'll say, I'd rather just pay the whole fee. So the person will then have to pay all of the money at once, right? Or go on a payment plan. But the bottom line, though, is that at the end of the day, what ends up happening is, when you're doing this, on paper, it looks like the court is more punitive towards Hispanics than non-Hispanics. When in reality, it wasn't the judge's discretion. Now, in other cases, there clearly is a discrimination where Hispanics or blacks are, in fact, discriminated upon and given heftier penalties. So we have to make those distinctions. So it became very difficult for us to do that, but the data collection really helped us. And finally, the nature of the data that was collected was not sufficient. We felt that they were not collecting the right information for us to be able to determine. I always tell people, it's very easy for people on both sides of the aisle to say, there's no racism, and then others to say, there is racism in the court. But we, social scientists, and criminologists in particular, we want evidence, we want data. The data is important. But if you give me data that is garbage, guess what my report is going to show? Garbage. Garbage in, garbage out, is what we say in statistics, right? So the idea is that we want to have data that is actually consistent with the truth, that it is captured correctly, so that we can actually make those analyses as well. So the data lacks sufficient clarity in terms of us not being able to audit it. And so what we ended up doing is we went back and we said all of these findings and deficiencies were outlined and were addressed. There were now quarterly data court reports that we do for this particular city. You know, I go in there and every quarter I extract the data, I look at it, I analyze it, and I provide that report to the government officials. I also do these annual reports that are crafted and they have all these charts. And just to give you an example of what the charts look like, right? So on the left side you see race and ethnicity, and then you see the cases that were filed under each race or ethnicity. And then you see the percentage of what those cases are. The cases that were disposed, you know, and then the outstanding cases as well that are rolling over from one to the other. So this is kind of a snapshot. It doesn't give you a lot of information, but we take this apart and we try to find out, why are these cases outstanding? Why are these cases disappearing? Why are these cases filed? And then also we look at the race and ethnicity on the left, and we look at the cases that are dismissed by the judge versus dismissed by the prosecutor. That's very important, by the way, because oftentimes the prosecutors are going to be biased too, right? So you're going to walk up to a prosecutor and say, you know, you show up in jeans and a t-shirt and a baseball cap, and you look like you can't afford anything, you know, and you walk up to you don't know the Constitution, you don't know the laws, and you walk up to that prosecutor in a nice suit that says to you, you got to pay this, you got to pay that. They throw the book at you. Then you have somebody that comes in a nice suit that walks up to them and says, excuse me, I think my 14th Amendment due process rights were violated in the U.S. Constitution. I would like to see exactly what my options are, and I'm going to bring this really, really, really good lawyer with me next time I come in here if we don't settle this matter at once. Guess what the reaction is going to be? Very different, right? So we know education matters. We also know race matters. We also know that socioeconomic status matters, some of which, by the way, is interconnected. So we actually looked into the cases that were dismissed by the judge, and then those that were dismissed by the prosecutor, and the reason why all of these cases were dismissed as well. So this sums it up in the sense that this is the kind of work that we do, right? This is when we talk about civil rights means a lot of things to a lot of people. But we are very intrusive in our research, in the sense that we are now beginning, and I want to leave you with this, because this is very important. I know that the Czech Republic is very different from the US. I understand that. And I know that Europe, this is not my first trip, right? I come here to Europe once, twice a year, and to Prague, this is my second time in your beautiful city. But I will tell you that in spite of the 5 significant historical changes in the Czech Republic, in spite of all the wonderful things that you're doing, and you're doing a lot of good things, right? We are a different country, and I understand that, and we have different contexts. But regardless of the country that you're in, whether it's the Czech Republic or the US, it is imperative that government not only has oversight, but it's imperative that there are people like me, like you, that are interested in knowing what the truth really is. Right? So because people often get confused in what they hear in the media, on both sides. You know, and the media often portrays a reality that's not existent. And so what I think our mission is, and I really take this seriously, because I think at no other time in the academic world, not ever since my fellow Greeks invented the idea of a university. I was telling Satirius the other day, I said, you guys are to blame for this disaster. You know, but I will tell you that not ever since the conception of academia, since the days of Plato and Aristotle, and even prior to that, like one of the things that you have to understand is the importance of an academic education. And the importance of the role that we academics, are those that have an education, will play going forward. Because we are the ones that are going to be commissioned with interpreting what that truth is. And if we are not there, not only as activists trying to push the issues, but if we are not there as trying to understand what is going on. And I believe, and I will say this, that there are a lot of people in the US, a lot of law enforcement folks, a lot of court folks that want to make a difference. They want to change. They want to be transparent. I'm telling you, I've worked with these people. They're amazing. They look at me and they say, Dr. Del Carmen, show me that it's broken and I will fix it. And I believe them. And I sometimes show them that it's broken and they fix it right away. And so there are a lot of people out there that really want this to work. But they don't know what they don't know. I want you to remember that. They don't know what they don't know. So they walk around like with blindfolds oftentimes, and they don't understand. And you know, my grandmother, who had a high school education, but was probably one of the most well-read people that I've ever met in my life, and I'm an academic. She said something to me one day that was very profound. She says, smart people are often quiet because they know their limitations. The ones that are not very smart are the loudest in the room because they think they can do it all. Because they have no idea what their limitations are. And I will tell you that oftentimes I use that in the sense of what I do because I think it's important for us to really understand before we opine. It's very important for us to try to scientifically measure it because no one can argue against science. No one. And if somebody comes in, if I come in loaded with statistics, and I tell you right now, this is what the statistics show, you can often tell me, well, that's your angle. No, this is reality, because I've looked at it with 16 different angles, and this is the reality that I'm showing to you. Dr. Goldstein, who is the author of community policing in the world, the idea of community policing, police departments talking to the community, he invented. Some years back, him and I had breakfast. He's an older gentleman, and I said to him, Dr. Goldstein, what is the future of police? What is the future of courts? And he said to me, they're each going to need somebody that understands numbers, a criminologist. Because in the future, and this is where we are in America today, if you're not able to prove it by numbers, if it's not documented, it will be questioned. It will be questioned. And so oftentimes police departments are beginning the idea now of understanding that they have to measure all of this in order to be able to be accountable. So thank you very much. I know that I exceeded my time as I typically do, but I wanted to make sure. I gave you a lot of information, so I expect a lot of questions, right? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was amazing.
Thank you.
I told you were going to be impressed, right? So whoever has questions, please just raise your hand. I'll give you the mic because we're sort of broadcasting it back to Texas, so that also in Texas, hi.
But by the way, Jana said Texas, not U.S. You notice that? So she already qualified. You're already qualified to be a Texas citizen. You know?
Okay. I would have to learn the accent. I just can't do it.
Y'all.
Yeah.
You say y'all.
I can't. Anyways, so whoever has questions, if you can introduce yourself, that would be great, and please make sure that your question is straightforward, okay? We're straight shooting in here.
Yep, there you go. No questions. That basically, by the way, either it means that I have been completely ineffective, or that I was so effective that I have no questions, which the latter is not an option today.
Okay, we do have a question here.
Yes, question. My name is Dave Van. I go to the University of New York in Prague.
Great school.
Thanks. I have a question, since you're so concerned and influential with law enforcement and civil liberties, and I was wondering what your thoughts were on maybe ex-Sheriff Joe Arpaio and the things that he did in Phoenix, and maybe if you had any thoughts or opinions on like his case or his department.
So that's a great question. I'm glad you asked that. So I will tell you that Joe Arpaio, for those of you that don't know, is a Sheriff Arpaio is a sheriff, an ex-sheriff, a former sheriff, that was actually a sheriff in Maricopa County, Arizona. And Sheriff Arpaio had very, quote-unquote, unconventional ways of dealing with his prisoners. One of which was to force them to wear pink underwear and sleep in the middle of the desert, you know, cold or hot, to be able to demonstrate that they were truly being punished. Also, by the way, he launched a war against immigrants, and particularly undocumented immigrants, where they would actually do raids and put people through just an incredible ordeal, right? So the U.S. Joe Arpaio enjoys the benefit several titles that he has, some of which I can't repeat in this room, but I'll tell you that one of the titles that he has is he is one of the few people in America that's ever been put under a consent decree, not only by the U.S. Department of Justice, but also by the ACLU. He was very effective in having 2 major consent decrees in one jurisdiction. He was also, by the way, convicted, as you know, for his crimes, and the current president of the United States actually pardoned him, which is a sort of an extraordinary thing that this happened while his own United States Department of Justice in a previous administration had actually investigated him and had found him to do all this. So I think he's sort of an anomaly. You know, from what I understand, he's considering running, or he's running for office now, which I'm sure that a lot of like racist groups in America will vote for him. But they may be out of his jurisdiction at this time, you know. But he has sort of become a symbol of defiance. And more, I don't think he's really changed much, except the fact that I think he's become sort of symbolic in the U.S. for people that have zero tolerance on immigrants. And so he sort of becomes to us, to me personally, he has become sort of the symbol of what we fight. You know, and to some people in America, what has become, sadly, it has become the cause, or a martyr of the cause. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, you bet. Anyone else? This is your chance. We're not charging you for the questions.
Not yet. Not yet.
Not yet. There's a question there.
Hi, my name is Jeff Howell. I'm also from the University of New York.
Great school. What are you majoring in? What are you studying?
English literature.
English lit?
Yeah.
Well, you know, this, by the way, relates to English lit, because obviously English literature was written by people that are passionate, right? So your next one will be on what? On civil rights in the U.S.?
Actually, I wanted to ask you, these reforms you discussed tonight, do they extend to the penal system as well? Are they also subject to these sort of consent agreements, particularly in the area of privatized prisons, and those sort of laws that are designed to artificially inflate prison populations?
Absolutely. That's a great question. So the consent decree idea, right, and the whole core idea of reform has not only focused on police and courts, but it has also extended to prisons, right? So poor prison conditions when, sheriffs are put under a consent decree. Sheriffs typically run the prisons and jails. Those are that are governmental based. And so they're also put under consent decrees as well by the US DOJ. And also, by the way, private entities like pharmaceutical companies, or a business practice that hasn't really done things, that does work with government, but hasn't done it ethically, or hasn't done it well. So there's been cases filed where these particular entities have actually some sort of a consent decree attached to them as well. So yes, it has extended beyond that, but the core, most of the activity is in police reform. And then there's been some on the court reform as well, which I mentioned. Good question, great question. Yep. This is clearly, by the way, representative of your line of thought of your wonderful professors that you have in this room. For I know I'm serious. I often tell students that the most important thing to do in a session like this or in a classroom is not the answer, is to formulate the question. And those are great questions. So congratulations to the faculty and administration from UNIT. Other questions? Come on. I saw some heads nodding. So either good or bad.
Okay, while you're thinking, maybe I will ask 2 questions.
Jana has like a series of questions. Scary.
I hope that I will formulate them correctly. So my first question would be related to the fact that how does the reform solve the problem that many of the police departments basically run on the motivation that in order to get more money, they have to make more arrests. So in other words, more arrests means more money for the department. That would be my first question. And the second question, you mentioned that there were 19 reforms. The reforms were particularly related to a city or like a state, or what does it cover? Actually?
Yeah, so yeah, great questions. The second question first, I'll tell you that the 19 cases are all over the U.S. So there's not one particular state that sort of stands out over another. I can tell you that, for instance, they range all the way. And just so you know, 2 weeks ago, Tarleton, my school, the School of Criminology, we hosted what we call the second annual conference on consent decrees. And we first time in U.S. history that we bring the civil rights, the entire division of civil rights lawyers from US DOJ, from DC, from Washington. We brought in 8 of the 12 federal judges that sit on these cases, and we brought the federal monitors like myself and the police chiefs all in one room. And I had dinner. Well, listen, I organized it, so I tell you, with a lot of help from my colleagues. But I'll tell you that we put it at the A&M Law School in Fort Worth. That's where we hosted it. But these are people that I worked with for 20 years that we've invited, this and the other. But I had dinner with the 8 federal judges alone. I was the only non-judge in the room. And I will tell you that it was a fascinating dinner. I've learned more in the 2.5 hours that I heard these people talk about what was in their heart, more so in their mind, than probably anywhere else. And I will tell you this, they're all from all over the place. All the way from Seattle, Los Angeles, Albuquerque. We had the judge from Baltimore, because Baltimore just went under a consent decree. We had the judge from Cleveland, Ohio. The judge from New Orleans, Susie Morgan. We had Judge Gelby from Puerto Rico. So no, there's no statistical sort of geography on that. On the first question, it's a great question. So when a consent decree takes place, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, because I think in the years that I've done civil rights stuff, especially with law enforcement, I can only describe it as this, and I'm not trying to be poetic, I'm really telling you this from a non-English literature component. It is a trauma to the organization. It is traumatic. Now, some people like me would argue it's a necessary trauma, but it is nevertheless a trauma. And so what happens is that there are people that immediately retire. There's been people that, there was a guy in New Orleans that worked as a police officer for 40 years. And this guy ran all of the overpay of all of the police officers. What that means is that if you're a police officer in New Orleans, you work 40 hours, right? And then if you want to work another 20 hours, like you want to go to the Superdome, or this guy was the guy that would assign you to these jobs. The most powerful person in the entire police department, more so than the chief. Because what this guy would do is, if you really made him happy, guess what? You have the greatest job ever. You were inside the Superdome on a 95-degree weather day. But if you really made him mad, absolutely, no, we really cannot find anything for you right now. Or we may put you out in the parking lot with a bulletproof vest in 110-degree weather. So the point is that these people, they retired. They began to retire. And so that allowed for the organization to begin to sort of cleanse itself. And then there was a certain schizophrenia that took place within the police department that when they saw us come in, when I walk into a classroom, my students typically dread the idea that they're going to have statistics that day or something to equivalent. But I've never seen a physical reaction from people as I did even in Orleans and Puerto Rico now when you walk in a room. There's a certain nervousness that they have immediately because first of all, they know that I have been around 20 years around them. And secondly, they know that whatever they do, I'll text the judge. You know what I mean? So the point is this guy is truly, doesn't have a gun, I don't have a badge, I'm not a police officer, but I work for the United States judge. And there have been cases, I won't tell you where, but there have been cases where the federal judge in a hearing has heard from a police officer or a police commander with a lot of ego interrupting the judge. I was in the room when the judge looked at him and said, "One more from you, and I will hold you in contempt, and you will not be going home today." I mean, when you think about the power that a federal judge has to order your immediate arrest because you have been violating, I mean, it's serious. And by the way, that's not a career-making move, So as a result of that, there seems to be an impact that is automatically caused. The question really is, and I think this goes to the nature of your question, what happens after the decree is over? And that's where we are sort of beginning to see that now, where some cities like Seattle, for instance, are ending their consent decree. And so Carmen Best, who is the interim chief over there, I know very well, through the IACP Civil Rights Committee that I belong to, and Carmen is doing a great job. But the thing is, what happens 5 years or 10 years down the road when some of the old habits may begin to play? I only make the analogy of a person that's been sick for a long time, that goes to a doctor that finally puts them on a diet, exercises, gives you the proper treatment. You get well, but to get well, you have to maintain yourself as being well. Because if you go back to your old habits, you're likely going to fall prey to that again. So I hope that answers that. Yeah. Anybody else? This is your chance.
Charles Ross, European Anti-Corruption Center. Thank you for your excellent talk.
Thank you, Mr. Ross.
What are the next 2 or 3 challenges that you see for your teams, and what needs to be done to get the answers you need?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So I think that some of the challenges that lie ahead for us have to do with support or lack thereof. There's been some challenges with the politics, because politics matter, right, in the work that we do. And so oftentimes you've got governors, you have state people, you have local police chiefs, like they change, personnel changes, and they don't have the same sort of investment on these reform cases that we have. So for us, it's frustrating sometimes when we work so hard in trying to provide a good report for the city to know, and for the people, more importantly, to know. We had in New Orleans our first meeting in a very poor neighborhood of New Orleans. And we came in, and I could not believe it was a Baptist church. I could not believe the number of people in the room. And there was a woman that walked up to the door, and she says, "I will lock myself to this door, and I will not allow anybody to leave until you provide all the answers that we want." There was clearly a desperation in people's minds. They wanted to get us to be the answer. They said, "Just take over the police department." They fire everybody, and we can't do that, right? So they confuse us often with the government. They're like, "Oh yeah, you're the government, so you're the Department of Justice." We're like, "No, we're not the Department of Justice. We work for the federal judge." Same difference? No, not really. And so clearly for us, it was the fact that the expectations were very high, and we had to tell them this is a marathon, not a sprint. This is something that will take time. And experts tell us that it takes 10 years for an organization to change. And so for us, it was a matter of just being able to, I think one of the challenges continues to be that. The other one is politics. Politicians really have set the tone, the rhetoric. And I'm not here, I don't criticize my government, particularly when I'm outside of the United States. When I go back home, I do criticize it quite a bit. But outside the U.S., we're all Americans, and I'm very proud of being one. Being an American by choice, not by birth. And I will tell you this as an American by choice, that one of the things that oftentimes comes up to me is the fact that, politics get in the way. And they oftentimes set the tone. And when they set the tone, they obstruct the view that some people have locally about what we're doing. They think we're a whole bunch of liberals walking around with ACLU cards trying to do things, and we're not. We're not labeled. I refuse to be labeled or defined by a political party or by a cause. And what I often say is I'm here working for the people. because I believe in those 3 words of we the people in the Constitution. And so at the end of the day, for us, it's just a challenge of politics and a challenge of the expectations of the community that we actually meet them and hopefully one day exceed them. So, great question. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Anybody else? This is what professors do. They give you a long answer to a very short question. So that's why you're not asking anymore. Well,
I might have one more.
go for it.
So since the topic of the talk was Ferguson,
Yep.
partially,
Yep.
I was wondering if you could comment about the changes that followed, because, I mean, there were a lot of issues, one of them being the fact that 90% of the police force was white, 10% African American, serving in a completely different community.
Yep.
So have there been any changes?
Yeah. So there's been changes, yes. And we actually had the Ferguson folks at our conference last week, or a week and a half ago. So I had a chance to talk to them. And Jude, for instance, who's a DOJ civil rights lawyer from DC, is a good friend of mine. Jude was the one that led the investigation. Jonathan White, another DC friend of mine, lawyer, was in DOJ at the time doing that. So I'm very familiar with Ferguson. I can tell you that yes, there have been changes. There have been a few changes. But Ferguson was very dysfunctional in how they handled the reform initially. I don't know if you know this or not, but what actually happened was the city council of the city of Ferguson decided that they were going to designate 3 or 4 people to negotiate the contract with US DOJ, right? So it's kind of like I say to you, Jana, just go handle it, right? So I give you the full authority. So these people went out and they spent thousands of hours with the US DOJ attorneys because Ferguson is a tiny city and their budget is very limited. So they said it cannot exceed $1 million. Which, by the way, $1 million is like pocket change. I mean, it takes a lot of money to fly people in like me and to pay them by the hour and all this other stuff. And so they said, so they went back and forth. Finally, they reached an agreement. And so these so-called designees went back to city council and said, folks, we have great news. We spent 2,000 hours on this, but we got US DOJ to agree to $1 million. And guess what city council said? You're all fired. We don't like the answer that you gave us. We're going to fight DOJ in court. It's almost like they forgot to take their mental pill that day. You know what I mean? Like their pills. So they went back. They went to court, and as they were headed to court within a week, I kept on thinking, what did they just do? And so like a week later, they said, oh, never mind. We're going to go ahead and accept it. So just from the start, it was sort of dysfunctional. What ended up happening in Ferguson is they began to sort of create these conditions. And one of the things that the police department folks were in the room with me, and some of the attorneys for the city were there too, as well as the monitors. And one of the things that they said to me was, Ferguson could have happened anywhere in the U.S. By the way, that's their quote, not mine. And so they felt that they were picked on because it was such a high-level profile case, but it truly was nothing different from other jurisdictions. By the way, I completely agree with that, in the sense that it wasn't any different from other jurisdictions. But what was important is they've made some changes, but not as much as Baltimore. Baltimore was fascinating because in Baltimore, they actually knew that the consent decree was going to happen. So the police department began to work on things a year prior to this decree coming into play. So by the time the decree came into play, they said, hey, you got to improve your lesson plans. Done. Hey, you got to improve your policies. Most of them have been done. Now, there's still a lot of work to be done, but they did start early before that happened. But Ferguson, I would argue, is maybe 10-15% improved, but it has a lot of work ahead of itself, and there is a great deal of work. Now, the courts have actually been the first priority because it was so inflammatory what was found. And I would encourage you, by the way, to read the report. You can just Google it, US DOJ Ferguson report, and you will see that chapter, I believe it's 3 or 4, that focuses on the court. Read it. It's got case studies, anecdotal information, and all of that about the courts. That's the first thing that they infused to change in. They got rid of the judge. They went ahead and changed their bylaws. They have video cameras in the courtroom now. So, yeah. Anyway, other questions? Yes.
My name is Teresa Hartova. Thank you for your presentation. You talked about the importance of data.
Yep.
I absolutely agree with that. I just have to say I'm a little bit confused as an outsider as well, non-American. I'm just a little interested in the issue. I'm just confused because I'm not the one who has the kind of insight into the data, right? I've never been once to Baltimore. I have some sort of idea what might going on because it was not a nice experience that I had.
Right.
I haven't heard that book, but probably you know Heather McDonald. She gave presentations. I found it at least interesting.
Yep.
So there are, it's a political issue as well. So there are two parts, there are arguments, and for an outsider like me, what would you recommend where to go for to get an idea of what the truth is actually?
About what the truth is? Yeah. So it depends on the country and it depends on the jurisdiction, right? So you know, I lived under communism for a few years. So I can tell you that the truth of communists is not certainly the truth of the people, you know? And so oftentimes you get into these political realms of like what people think is the truth versus what is really the truth. But from a scientific perspective, what I think is important for us in the United States, for instance, if your question relates to the US, and I don't know that it does or not, but if it goes to the US, I would certainly look for these reports that these federal monitors are producing. Because I think we're pretty accurate in what we say. Why? Because we have no political agenda. Right, so our job is not, like, I'm not there to condemn the chief or pass judgment on the police department. Oftentimes you'll see these reports that are very well balanced, right? So they'll highlight what's really good about the department and they should continue to do, but then also the things that are deficient. Now, what the media covers oftentimes are the deficiencies. You know, they'll say, you know, the federal monitor finds the police department to be responsible for this. But they also miss the first 500 pages, all of which relate to the good things that are now finally improving. And so I would say that our reports are balanced. And then we have the Poverty Law Center, which is a great resource. We have, you know, oftentimes they put publications. We also have the International Association of Chiefs of Police, IACP, that oftentimes goes in there and does the research on some of these policies. So there's, in the US at least, you know, I ignore the Czech Republic's sort of checks and balances, but in the US, there are a lot of organizations and entities that produce this data, a lot of non-profit groups that sort of gather the data and they highlight the deficiencies in the data, the things that are good about the data, and then those things that we can consider to be truthful, whether good or bad. So that does exist in the US. And of course, what happens oftentimes very sad is that the media will grab it and then we'll set it, we'll put it out on only the negativity, which we obviously loses credibility for the person reporting it, and then the politicians will use it to serve their agenda, right? As you pointed out in your question, it's very political. So the politicians will say, under such and such governor, the police department was put under a consent decree. Now I'm going to come in and clean this thing up. Well, not really, because you have no jurisdiction to do this, right? So I'll give you an example, right? So the Attorney General, the current Attorney General, when he assumed the role of AG, Sessions, he said, these consent decrees, we're going to start investigating them and figuring out which ones we can end. And a lot of us laughed, and, you know, privately. And they said, why are you laughing? They said, because he has no authority to do that. He has the authority to investigate all he wants. But these are open court cases. The only person that can close this is the federal judge. Not even the president of the United States can say, close New Orleans. He can whistle, he can tweet that. but he cannot. He cannot close it. Because the only person that can close that case is the federal judge, Susie Morgan, that is assigned to that case. And so my point in telling you this is that there's a lot of political rhetoric. Now, the US DOJ can petition the court and say, we would like to close this case. But a lot of these judges will tell you, I don't care if DOJ is here asking me all they want to ask me. At the end of the day, I'm going to do what's right for the people. If they're ready to close it, we'll close it. We may close it early, but we're not going to close it until the job gets done. So, you know, there's some truth there. So, anyway, other questions? None. I hope that answers your question, does it? I have to get one from Oscar, by the way. And just to warn you, he may do this in Spanish. And so I'm just kidding. Claro, lo que tú quieres.
One question about the police. You just confused me. I forgot the question.
I'm good at that. You can tell my students. I often tell them if it's that important, do it in Spanish, and most of them don't speak it, so it's good.
Now I can remember, but maybe I have to formulate it in Spanish. No, it's about the age. In your findings in data, is there a generational, when there is racism in police, when there are practices in which minorities are targeted, are there different perceptions and different approaches by police officers that they are young and old, or this is something institutional? Once you become a policeman, you become part of a system where there are certain practices that they are part of the institution. That's very worrying.
I understand the question. It's actually a great question, and I'll expand it even more, right? So some people think that, they tell me, well, you were in New Orleans and you did some work on racial profiling too, right? So he says, how can you have racial profiling in New Orleans when most police officers are black? And the answer that I give them is, you know, police officers that are black in New Orleans are police officers first, and they're black second in the eyes of many people in the community. You understand? So what that means is that if you get stopped by a black police officer and you happen to be black, you can still be subject to the same harassment and various other things and deprivations of your civil liberties. Just the fact of being Caucasian or being white doesn't necessarily entitle you to that accusation. So moreover, by the way, when it comes to being young and being old, so I know I see a lot of millennials in this room, so I'm not going to have a rebellion when I say this. But millennials are sort of wired very differently from non-millennials, right? And we had this conversation in the police department not too long ago here in Prague, where, you know, millennials are coming in with a lot of technology, very bright people. You know, they've grown up in a more diverse world, you know, because they now see what we call in America blended families, where you may have, for instance, an African-American male with a Caucasian woman. That's now becoming more normative in the United States. Hispanics marrying, we Hispanics are the fastest growing minority in the U.S. And so oftentimes you see a Hispanic person married to a Caucasian person or someone who's black. So you are beginning to see that. And I think millennials are more in tune with that racial diversity than my generation or previous generations were. So to that end, we see, in fact, that there is some help there. But this is the part that your question invites me to tell you this. This is fascinating. So in addition to that, millennials are also more prone to express their feelings in social media. Where my generation, you and I would have a cup of coffee down the street, and we would try to, I as having Spanish descendancy and you being a Spaniard, we would solve the problems after 2 glasses of wine and 3 mancheros, 4, I'm sorry. 4 glasses of wine, and we would be done, right? But then you would go home, I would go home, we would both be happy thinking that we had a wonderful conversation. We solved absolutely nothing, but it gave us the ability to express our feelings, right? So that's what we do. Millennials don't do that. Millennials Snapchat. Millennials Facebook, which, as my daughter puts it, that's so old, Dad. That's so old. Like nobody's Facebooking anymore. Only your generation. I think I'm technologically savvy because I'll post like something on Facebook, and my daughter will quickly, she's 18 years old, she'll quickly tell me, she's like, that's so like yesterday, Dad, is what she says. You know, so Snapchatting, like we're going somewhere and she's constantly posting. You know, like I have people in my living room sometimes that have no idea which part of the world they're in because they're on FaceTime. You know? So my point is that millennials are more likely to express themselves. And we've had incidents. We had one recently where this is a true case where a police officer that was a millennial, in Texas you have to be 21 to be a police officer. And in most states in the US, you have to have a minimum age of 21. And so this is a police officer in Texas who was 22 years old, had just graduated from the academy. Listen carefully. He had gone to post something on Facebook, which I'll tell you in a second what it was. And then he goes to stop a woman who is black. Well, the woman accuses him of racial profiling. She felt she was being treated discriminatorily. Not only stopped for discriminatory purposes, but the way she was treated, the way she was talked to, the way she... So he went back. Right? He went back, you know, to the police station, and, you know, the next day or so, an accusation came forward, you know? And so the lawyers that provided the accusation said, this police officer is racist. And the police chief said, no, he's not. Their first instinct is to be defensive, you know? And no, he's not. So they went back to Facebook. And what he posted on Facebook was a picture of his grandfather wearing a cone hat of the KKK, and how proud he was that his grandfather has such a great legacy. And so what we're finding is that although there is a sort of, on the one side, they're more open-minded to things, right? On the other hand, some of them are just a lot more vulnerable to their own reality because they want to put everything in here on here, or texting. And so everything that they put down, like we have interviews for millennials, for police officers, and we do what's called a social media sweep. And this is for all of you in the audience, by the way, in case you apply for a government job in the US or any job in the world, right? So we do a sweep. So initially, we don't even look at an applicant unless we will have somebody and you find everything on social media. I mean, I can find everything on social media. And so what they do is they go in there and they'll come back with a file that big. And they go, I don't think we want to hire this guy. Why? Or this woman. Why? Because we had one case recently where the guy was putting on Facebook inside the airplane, I cannot wait to stand up because this person from India smells and they should all be banned from coming into the US. And then he goes to apply for a job as a police officer. So, but that is part of his script. You know, so you just look at somebody like that, and in the US, if you don't do the right thing because you think you need to do the right thing, you do the right thing because of the fear of being sued. Because we're a litigious society. Everybody sues everybody. So you have a police chief that receives this email, and it gets, so let's say you're the chief of police in Texas, and I give you this file, and I say, Chief, this guy wrote this on the email. And you say, oh, let's hire him. Deliberate indifference, US DOJ. You just hire somebody that if they go out and do something illegal and unethical, guess what's going to happen? They're going to say, you deliberately, indifferently hire that person in spite of that social media tweet. It's incredible. So it's an interesting phenomenon that is happening across the board, but it is to the fabric. But the jury's mixed. The jury's mixed in millennials. So we're finding that some of them are very open-minded, and some others are just simply, you know, incredibly open to what they write and put on social media, which gets them in trouble oftentimes. I often tell my young students, I'm like, do not write it down. Like, put it on a piece of paper somewhere, hide it in your pocket, and burn it at the end of the day. If you have to self-express, do that. But don't do it. People think that social media is private. And some people say to me, well, but as a police officer, when I'm home, I'm not a police officer. And I say to them, yes, you are. Because if you see a crime, you are legally required to intervene. Right? So the point is that you're a cop 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So social media does not take a break. And they say it's unfair, so is the world. Get over it. You know what I mean? And move on. Do something else. When they begin to complain to me about, oh yeah, this is really tough, I can't express myself on Snapchat. You know what? Do something else. Nobody forced you to be a police officer. There are thousands of jobs in the U.S. Go find something that is not social media. You know, by the way, I don't think of any jobs these days that are not subject to social media inquiry, right? So we can't put any. You guys think that you put everything on social media, right? What you eat, which I find that fascinating. People just kind of take a picture of their coffee, like, okay, somehow this coffee is going to smell to me in a certain way. You know, if my good friend, you know, Tyrus goes to Athens and he takes a picture of the most amazing falafel, you know, in the world, and he's out there eating it, you know, and a nice biscuit and a nice coffee, and he's like, what am I going to look at? I say, so Tyrus, make sure you take, you know, the proper medication before you take this, or should I say, oh my God, I wish I could be there, you know? So I mean, I just don't understand the logic behind it, but they're constantly taking pictures of themselves, they're constantly doing all this stuff, and they're putting their hearts and minds into the world of social media, which comes back and bites them. I'm sure, you know, that the judge here can tell us stories in the Czech Republic as well, where you oftentimes, the intent of a crime is oftentimes displayed on social media prior to this. You know, what the person thinks, what the person's racist remarks are. It's very hard and very difficult to hide racist people. So, anyway, great question. Anybody else? Final question? Yes.
Hi, I'm Amina. I'm a business administration student at the University of New York in Prague.
Oh, that's great.
My question is, does your department have the jurisdiction to investigate the president?
That's a great question. So all right, so not specifically, as a federal monitor, my job is not to investigate the president. So no, I don't do that. But in the United States, the way this works, because of all the things that are going on, I can understand why you would want to ask that question. So what happens is, in a democracy such as the US, there's typically the United States Department of Justice has the jurisdiction to investigate the president, right? So the entity that investigates the police department also can investigate the president. So what will typically happen is the Attorney General of the United States, who by the way is appointed by the president. Kind of ironic, right? So the president appoints this person, but this person has the ethical obligation that if the amount of information rises to appointing a special investigator, that they will do so. And so in the case of the current president, right, US DOJ actually appointed, you know, Mr. Mueller, who is the former director of the FBI, to investigate this so-called Russia probe and various other things. And so in the course of doing that, these investigators, in this case, Mr. Mueller, by the way, is a fascinating guy. If you ever do like some background on him, I had a chance to meet the director Comey. I had a chance to speak to him actually for a few minutes about some of the stuff that he did on civil rights, which I was very happy. He's a very bright guy. And then I never met Director Mueller, but when I went to the Citizens Academy, he signed my deal. So I have it in my office, and it creates all kinds of interesting conversations, for my students that come in to my office sometimes. But Mueller is a former lieutenant in the United States Army during Vietnam. This is a guy who is very, very tough. And I know a lot of people. I work with the FBI. I do a lot of work with them. And the people that I know tell me that, he's a very focused, very serious person. He has the respect of a lot of people. So they appointed him as a special investigator to lead this investigation. And so hypothetically, and I honestly don't know, and I don't opine on whether the investigation is good, bad, or ugly, that's not my concern, but I will tell you that if in fact he finds things, right? If he finds something that rises up to the level of a criminal accusation, then at that point he will turn that information to the Attorney General and to the U.S. Congress. And so just in the case of Bill Clinton, for instance, when he was president, and he lied under oath, right? So he was held as having had, an impeachable offense. So then the Congress then will vote for the president's impeachment. And so our country believes in its core fabric that no individual, regardless of any creed, background, or position in government, is higher than the law of our country. George Washington, who is considered to be not only our first president, but really truly the one that framed, sort of with the help of the founding fathers, as we call them, the concept of democracy in America. George Washington's famous quote was, we are a nation of laws. And that is oftentimes something that resonates among people throughout the country, because we believe that no one exceeds the laws in our country, and even the president could be impeached and could be fired from his or her job if in fact he rises to that level. And I will tell you that our democracy is not perfect. And as Benjamin Franklin once said, it's far from perfect, but it's the best thing we've got. And one of the things that I will tell you, a historical thing, how many students are from UNIT here? University of New York in Prague. Yeah, great. So I'm going to tell you this if you're a student, right? So we have some other students from other schools, but so if you're a student, an interesting fact about what I just said. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. Right? So these are two names that you should hopefully know at some point. John Adams was our second president, and Thomas Jefferson became our third president. Right? Thomas Jefferson is considered to be an intellectual. He was quite fond of the French. And so he brought us a lot of our French traditions to America, including, by the way, the Constitution, which was largely influenced by the French. But I will tell you this, because I think you'll find this fascinating. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams fought each other. They were very best friends. They were the best of friends. And then they fought each other because of politics. And Thomas Jefferson ran against John Adams' re-election and won, and Thomas Jefferson became president. And John Adams was not, except, John Quincy Adams, his son, became eventually president. But they sort of disliked each other, hated each other, perhaps, over a number of years. And then at some point towards the end, you know what ended up happening? They became friends again. And they wrote each other letters, which, by the way, you should read, because they're fascinating. And they talk about our democracy. Listen carefully, and I want to say this, because this is very important. They both died on the 4th of July, within hours of each other. So as America was celebrating its independence, and they could hear the fireworks and cannons and various other things of Americans celebrating the liberty, their anniversary of the liberty, John Adams eloquently said, Thomas Jefferson just died, and now it's my turn. So, I mean, if you think about from a statistical perspective, what are the odds of that, right? And so they died within hours of each other with no ability to communicate via social media or chat, or Snapchat, that they were dying. So it's a fascinating concept, but it underscores the democracy of our nation. We have been challenged before. Perhaps like no other time now. Perhaps our challenge is now, because we're challenged by immigration. We're challenged immigration discussions. We're challenged by sort of an inspired hatred for minorities that has risen in my country. That is very, very concerning to those of us that do civil rights stuff, right? So there's been this rhetoric now that is inspiring people that are really not only ignorant, but people that are very violent. That are sadly, they're getting inspired to do things that many of us are just shaking our heads saying, whatever happened to the work of Dr. King walking Selma? Whatever happened to Malcolm X? Whatever happened to the courage of Rosa Parks? Whatever happened to the thousands of people that have spent hours working on the civil rights things? And at the end of the day, now somebody writes something on Snapchat, and then all this other, or tweets it, whoever that person may be, and people get inspired to hate. People get inspired. I've had personal cases where my sister, who's in Boston, is a medical doctor at Harvard, very, very bright woman, who was on the phone talking to my parents in Spanish, my parents that live in Nicaragua still. And she's talking to them in Spanish, and somebody comes right behind her and says, you need to get off the phone, you SO, all this other stuff, immigrant, go back to the country where you came from. You have, like my son that goes to a predominantly Jewish school, that, they receive threats every other day, from people that want to do harm because you don't look like somebody else. And so that's the world in which we live. Oftentimes, I get my friends that tell me, after you teach the Chiefs on a long 6-hour journey, you may have to have somebody else turn on your car, because clearly it's going to explode, But it's not as bad as that. I've always believed that people are for the most part, are good people. And I've had a good experience with law enforcement. I've dealt with people that are open-minded because they know where I'm coming from. If they hire me, if they want my help, they're going to know that, I'm not going to just go in there and rubber stamp what you do. But sadly, the rhetoric has now taken a turn. And by the way, it's influencing Europe, as you know. It's influencing Europe, it's influencing Africa, it's influencing the other continents. And I think that part of the issue is that if this continues, God help us. Because we're going to be a world that's going to be very divided among things that we should have already agreed on 100 years ago. So that's really my concern. But the impeachable offenses are the subject of the United States Department of Justice. And by the way, in this case, the president can fire Mueller. He can basically say, you're fired. But there's a belief that if that happens, history has taught us that it would be probably worse, for him to do that than anything else. And so America sort of forces you to be transparent, even if you choose not to, because of the way this system is. It's not perfect. And I'm the first one to tell you, it's far from perfect. But it really is inspirational. There are a lot of good people that love the Constitution. And I'll finish by telling you this. When the FBI hires the agents and they train them through the FBI in Quantico, it's a very, very difficult training. I've had a lot of former students that are now FBI agents that have gone through it. The very last day before they graduate, they used to do this, I don't know if they still do this anymore in Quantico, but they actually get you in a van and they drive you to Constitutional Hall in Washington, D.C. The academy, by the way, which is in Quantico, is not far from D.C., it's in Virginia, right? So they go to Washington and they close the doors to the public of where the Constitution is, which is, by the way, guarded 24/7, as you can imagine. One of the copies, we have several. And the FBI agents, or the future FBI agents, are taken there. And they're shown the Constitution. And they're told this: no matter who's president, no matter who is in power, no matter the politics, your faith and your dedication and your obligation to duty is with the Constitution. That's pretty extraordinary, if you really think about that. I mean, to be able to say that no matter who is in charge, at the end of the day, regardless of what you hear about the FBI, I have to tell you, that's pretty admirable. To be able to be loyal to a principle, to a code, that begins with we the people. So I started tonight with we the people, and I ended with we the people. Because at the end of the day, that's who I work for. And at the, people say to me, well, what? You've done all these things. And I said, no, I haven't done anything. I've served. I've served like many of you serve. But the one thing that I want on my tombstone is, he educated those that serve. Because at the end of the day, I believe that the education component of serving law enforcement, courts, personnel, corrections, diplomacy, whichever way you do, I believe that that education empowers people and that knowledge makes a difference. So I cannot thank you enough, by the way, for tonight. Thank you very much. You guys have been amazing. And if there are any questions, I'll linger around afterwards, so I can take whatever questions you have. Thank you. Thank you. That's good. Somebody asked me, what are your expectations? Not to get fired. I may not be allowed back in the U.S., but hell, here comes the Prague, right?